carrier update brought to you by Powerfleet. I'm here with Tony Mulvey. Tony, let's jump into it.
What's going on? So we've got our outbound tender volume index, right? So our measure of those shippers' requests for capacity, right? And what we've seen is this kind of downward trend, right? I mean, it started the beginning of February and it's been kind of falling off, and we've come up against really difficult comps, right? So this is a little concerning. I mean, volumes over the past week are down about 4%. So, I mean, you are starting to see a little bit of slower activity. I mean, we'll talk on it in a second, but I mean, rejections were flat. So that tells me it is actually volumes falling, not just being driven, because if you think about this index itself, it includes those rejected and accepted tenders. So it really tells you which way the market's going, and when you have a big fluctuation in rejections, it can kind of skew this one way or the other, kind of either propping it up or bringing it down. But when they're flat, I mean, it tells you what volumes are actually doing. We saw this spike last year. I mean, obviously, Texas freeze happened. We saw this massive dip, and then, boom, it hit the accelerator, and we stayed there, right, for the entire year. Well, we're starting to kind of level off and see this fall down to, I don't want to say where kind of we expected, this kind of trend, this downward trend, what we kind of thought would happen. I mean, we're not going to get back down here anytime soon, but I don't think we can get back up to these 15,000 unless something happens. Obviously, there's plenty that can go wrong. I mean, we've seen it, the Texas freeze, hurricanes. I mean, now with geopolitical risk, right? So there is that risk that we pop back up. We see those volumes continue to flow through that increased volume level. But I mean, on the other side, you've got inflationary pressures that are hitting the consumer that could drop this even lower, right? So it's kind of this risk and this balancing act, I would say. Our next chart here, we'll bring up our outbound tender rejection index. Really flat over the last week. I don't think I think it was last Friday, it was 18.88 as well. So, I mean, I don't think, it didn't really change at all. We saw the spike early this time last year. Obviously, Texas freeze did it, but we've been in this downward trend really since that point, right? So, contract rates definitely higher, and that's what's driving these rejections lower. Obviously, look back at 2020, early 2020, we were at 5%. Yeah. We're at 18. So, I mean, we're still ridiculous. I mean, it's crazy high when you think about it, but we're not 27%, right? So there is a little bit of good and bad. But I mean, where's this go? We've seen those contract rates up 20+% year over year. Well, we're not seeing, I mean, we're down from this at the 26, but I mean, we're still up around 20. I mean, that's 1 in 5 loads, right? So where do we go? I don't know. I would think we get somewhere closer to like 17.5 would be 17 would be my guess, especially as you think about what we're heading into. I mean, you do have produce season approaching. You've got shippers trying to move goods there before summer. I mean, you think about like a Christmas in July, for example. I mean, it's kind of like that peak. It's like a second peak season, right? So if you think about truckload peak, always around in that November, December range, well, the summer, or right leading into the summer is also that busy time. I mean, you've got, obviously, people are on vacation with, you're buying things, then you've got back to school, things like that. So, I mean, ultimately, this is gonna stay elevated. I mean, we're not gonna get down here, but I will say the comps get quite difficult for, I mean, the past few years. I mean, you look, eventually, this COVID-related increase, right, where we see all that spending and freight volumes start moving through, that becomes a 2-year comp, right? Not just 1 year. So we are going to see these comparisons look a little different here in the back half of the year.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I'm starting to look at some of the economic data as well, and looking at that year-over-year trend, it's starting to get really interesting. And some of those slower growth trends, it's still double-digit levels. Yeah. So it's going to be great to see what's going to look like 2 years from now and 3 years from now, what the new baseline is. Tony, thank you so much for this update. We'll check in with you again throughout the morning, but right now we're going to toss it over to Thomas Watson.